I'm Anna Rose. I'm the Exhibitions and Programming Associate at the Wende. Thanks so much for joining us today for the 17th talk in our Cold War Spaces series. Today, I'd like to welcome our guest, Daniel Immerwahr, on the topic of colonial space, beyond the logo map. Daniel is the Associate Professor of History at Northwestern University in Chicago, and is a scholar of US and global history, specializing in empire, development, and the history of ideas. He's the author of Thinking Small, the United States and the Lure of Community Development, and How to Hide an Empire, a history of the greater United States, which I have here, and I've been going through and highly recommend. And today's program will be a 30-minute conversation between Daniel and Joes Segal, the Wende's Chief Curator and Director of Programming. After that, there'll be about 15 minutes for Q&A, so please get your questions ready to put in the Q&A box during that time. As always, we appreciate all of your questions, but ask that you keep them short to a sentence or two. If you have comments or would like to share something longer, we have the chat function open, so feel free to put any comments there, but please remember it defaults to just the panelists, so if you want everyone to see, switch the blue button to all panelists and attendees. And as we're getting started, feel free to say hi and what city you're tuning in from. We'll be posting the recording of today's program on our Vimeo page, so afterwards, if you want to go back and watch it or share it, you can do that, and all of our previous programs. Lastly, I'd like to thank Susan Horwitz and Rick Feldman for generously supporting discussion series at the Wende and our virtual programs. And I'll hand it off to you to get started with the interview.
Okay, thank you, Anna Rose. The early decades of the Cold War are generally known as a period of decolonization. All over the world, colonies received or enforced independence. The United States considerably downgraded its colonial holdings by granting independence to the Philippines and incorporating Alaska and Hawaii as federal states. But that is not the end of the story. The US still has overseas territories such as Puerto Rico, the US Virgin Islands, Guam, and American Samoa, not to mention a large number of small Pacific islands and some 800 military bases worldwide, such as Guantanamo Bay. However, Daniel Immerwahr argues that the United States doesn't see itself as an empire, resulting in a kind of schizophrenia with regard to its overseas territories. Today, we are going to discuss some of the origins and consequences of this schizophrenia. Daniel, welcome to Cold War Spaces.
Hey, thanks for having me here.
Pleasure. So let me start by reading one paragraph from your book, How to Hide an Empire. I quote, "Scanning the library shelves, it's easy to find high-profile books from the interwar period depicting Native Americans and the Western frontier. But prominent treatments of overseas territories are rare. The only one with a truly large audience was Coming of Age in Samoa, from 1928 by the anthropologist Margaret Mead, a wildly popular ethnography that featured frank discussions of Samoan sexuality and launched Mead's career as one of the most famous scholars in the country. Yet, Mead wrote of Samoa and not American Samoa, the colony's legal name, and avoided mention of colonies, territories, and empires altogether. It is entirely possible to read Coming of Age without realizing that the brown Polynesian people she describes encountering on a South Sea island are in fact US nationals." End of quote. This is one of the many very enlightening and surprising examples you mentioned to substantiate the thesis that Americans generally don't speak about their empire. Why do you think is that?
Yeah, thanks for reading that. So as I was writing this book about the United States' territorial empire, so the focus on the inhabited territories, I asked the question, of course, at what points have people who are living in the states or on the mainland of the United States, at what point have they really interacted with that empire, thought about it, contemplated it in some way? And the answer is, there's a lot of times where that doesn't happen. There's a reason I call my book How to Hide an Empire. And it was sort of both interesting but frustrating to me that I could think of one really clear example, which is Margaret Mead's Coming of Age in Samoa, which is really important anthropological text and something that a lot of people were reading well outside of academia. But she, even in kind of putting a spotlight on American Samoa, she doesn't. She sort of hides it, because you can completely read this book and have no understanding that the place being talked about is part of the United States, and she doesn't call it American Samoa, which is its name. She just refers to the region of Samoa, and she's in the part of it that's in American Samoa, but she won't tell you that.
It's mind-blowing.
Yeah, I mean, but it's also emblematic, right? I mean, I found instance after instance of times when U.S. mainlanders just seemed kind of blithe and clueless about the overseas territories. And, it wasn't entirely a surprise to me, because that was my own history too. I grew up in Pennsylvania, and, I studied history, studied U.S. history with an interest in kind of foreign relations and related topics. And at no point, in my education, as a high school student, studying history in college, at no point did I even see a map of the United States that had Puerto Rico on it as part of the country. And I think if you'd asked me when I was in college, what's the deal with Guam, I'm not sure I could have given you an answer either. So, and so what's interesting is this sort of culture of ignorance, and I think is distinct to the United States, right? Britain didn't have it. Britain had a holiday, Empire Day, to celebrate the empire and discuss its contours. And the United States has been different in that respect. And the big question is why? And so one obvious answer is that there's a kind of misfit between the fact of having a substantial colonial empire, which the United States had and has and continues to have, and the values that the United States professes, right? The bid of the United States is often that this is a unique country, it's composed of self-governing states, and that notion of states joining together, uniting in a union on equal footing, both not only captures its internal character, but also what it wants for the rest of the world. And a colonial empire doesn't really fit that vision. I also think that the United States had so heavily culturally engaged with different kind of empire, settler colonialism of dislodging indigenous people violently and taking their lands, that became the way that a lot of people in the United States thought of empire and overseas territories, despite the fact that millions and sometimes tens of millions of people have lived in them, didn't really register or hadn't easily registered for a lot of people living in the U.S. mainland.
Yeah, you give some really surprising and shocking examples of that throughout your book. But let me first ask you, you're speaking about the logo map of the United States. Can you explain what you mean by that and why it's misleading?
Yeah. So I use this term, the logo map. It's not my term. It's from the political scientist Benedict Anderson. But the idea is this: if you were going to if you ask most people to imagine what the United States looks like, just sort of map it in their heads, there's an image that I think will come to mind, and I'm going to share my screen now. It's this image, right? I think that's how most people, that's what people think the United States looks like. And understandably, like, it is a logo map in the sense that it is, on advertising, and it is incorporated into the visual culture of the country in many ways. But here's something interesting. Those borders that you're looking at right now that are so familiar, those have been the borders of the United States for only 3 years of its history. So there are 3 years of US history where that's the accurate map of the country, 1854 to 1857, in case you were curious. And the reason is that right after the United States expands to the point where it has those borders, it keeps expanding and starts expanding overseas. So here's a map that I made, and I had to make it myself because I couldn't find a map that satisfied what I was looking for. I'll show you a map that I made of the United States in 1940, so right on the eve of World War II. And this shows the whole United States, and it also shows all the inhabited parts of it in an equal area projection and to scale. So you really get a sense of that. Oops, let me try to get that. That's the whole United States in 1940. The only parts that aren't to scale is I've shown clusters of uninhabited islands that the United States has annexed on the lower left and lower right sides. Those are, I magnified those to make them visible. But when you look at a map like this, what you realize is that the part of the country that we normally call the United States is actually just part of the country. It's a big part. It's a privileged part, but it's not the whole of the country. People in territories often call it the mainland, and I think rightly so. And so what I tried to do in my book, How to Hide an Empire, was to tell a history of the United States that wouldn't be a history of the logo map, but would be a history of the whole thing, which what some people at the turn of the century called the Greater United States.
Great, yeah. So we're focusing this conversation on the Cold War period as it's part of Cold War Spaces, but I want to ask you one question about the interwar years, and one specific instance you described about Puerto Rico with Cornelius Rhodes,
Yeah.
which in a sense is a very shocking preliminary to what happens also after 1945. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened?
Yeah, so I said earlier that there's a way in which mainlanders kind of don't engage with the fact of overseas territories or with the overseas territories themselves, but there are exceptions to that. And one exception is that empire often functions for mainland professionals as a kind of laboratory, as a space of experimentation. So there are lots of instances of architects, lawyers, doctors doing things in the U.S. territories that they couldn't have done in the States, and doing that knowingly. So I give a few examples of that in the book, but I tell the story of this Dr. Cornelius Rhodes, who had Harvard-trained doctor, who had gone from New York as part of a Rockefeller study of anemia, and he'd gone to Puerto Rico to study anemia, which is a fine thing to study, and a lot of Puerto Ricans suffered from it as a result of this parasite hookworm. But when he arrived in San Juan, he just became a different kind of doctor. And so he started running experiments where he would leave, hookworm disease untreated and anemia untreated, just to see what would happen in some of his patients. He induced it in others by altering their diet, making them ill to see how that would go. And then he wrote a letter in which he to a colleague in the mainland, where he discussed having intentionally killed 8 of his patients. It's very hard to say if he actually did do this, but the way he describes it, just with glee, and he says, we can do anything to the patients here, right? We can experiment on them, we can kill them. I've tried to. I'm curious if one can transplant cancer. That's a medical question I haven't been able to answer, and I've been transplanting cancer to Puerto Rican patients just to see if it would work. No luck so far. So there's 2 aspects of the story that are absolutely extraordinary. One, this idea that a doctor could go and just could have such impunity in this space, and I think that's a pattern that you see again and again in the U.S. colonial empire. And the other part of the story is this: he gets caught. The letter gets found, and suddenly there's within Puerto Rico a spotlight on him, and you think this has got to be the end for this guy, right? He's just confessed to murder, but he goes back to New York. And he is unscathed by this. Not only is he unscathed by this, he doesn't even get fired. He works his way quickly up the medical establishment to a point where he can oversee more medical experiments, including on Puerto Ricans, medical experiments that take place during World War II involving chemical weapons, mustard gases and such, that now are regarded as a sort of, major sort of ethical lapse that the U.S. Army was testing its own chemical weapons on its own people. And that also didn't stop him. He's remembered today not for the work he did in Puerto Rico, not for the work he did on Puerto Ricans. He's remembered today as one of the founders of chemotherapy. And the idea that someone could have that sort of reputation with that large, looming, kind of dark part in his past, and that would never come out during his lifetime or even after his lifetime, is, I think, a really good example of the ways in which empire in the colonial history of the United States has been hidden and has remained hidden for quite some time.
All right, it sounds a little bit like the Third Reich with Dr. Mengele.
He is a kind of Mengele figure. I mean, there's a level of sadism to which he does not rise that Mengele certainly hits, but yeah, he has that kind of aspect to him, the demented doctor.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, those experiments didn't stop after the Second World War. You mentioned the Panama Canal Zone, but also, of course, the nuclear bombs that were exploded on Pacific Islands. So there is this tension between those experiments and the claim of the United States to be a beacon of freedom and democracy, etc. Was that ever addressed by journalists, historians, politicians during the time? And if not, when did it become part of the historiography?
Yeah, I think there's a way in which it gets consistently brushed under the rug in mainland journalism. So there will be moments, for example, there's a really dramatic uprising in the early 1950s in Puerto Rico where there's a 7-city revolt and Puerto Ricans are demanding independence, and it culminates in an assassination attempt that is nearly successful on Harry Truman. So you think, God, if there's any moment where everyone's going to actually be paying attention to Puerto Rican independence as a cause, it'll be this moment. They nearly took out the president. But if you look at mainland press coverage, it mainly just says, you know, Puerto Ricans are crazy. Sometimes they get guns. Who can explain this kind of thing? And, you know, it's just a moment of a failure to connect. You mentioned the tests in the Bikini Atoll. Mm-hmm. So the United States very publicly tests nuclear devices. It runs 67 tests of nuclear weapons on or right around Bikini Atoll. And that's an inhabited part of the planet. And you know, all eyes are upon it. And so what the United States does is it stages this incredibly weird, almost play where it, you know, the naval officers go and ask the residents of Bikini, you know, for their permission to evacuate the island, and then to just, you know, bombard it relentlessly, and it's all on film, and the sort of residents sort of, you know, nod and say, you know, of course we'll do this. It's very important for the world, and ended up you know, they end up all being forcibly moved, never allowed to return to their homeland, and having a really rough history after that. But you know, we now know that they had very little idea of what they were consenting to. But nevertheless, it was really important for the Navy at that point to film this and to broadcast it, and to perform the act of liberal consent, even in a situation that I think we would easily describe as colonial exploitation.
Right, right. And was there a certain moment that this found the attention of critical journalists or others who actually wrote against it, or
I mean, there's a constant stream of criticism, often coming from the territories themselves or the people who live in the shadow of U.S. military bases. So to think that this is just sort of, you know, a natural fact and everyone accepts it would be absolutely wrong. I think the more interesting question is, at what moments have people on the mainland really wrapped their heads around the territorial empire of the country? And I think that one of the most promising moments is now. You know, it's just in the same way that the Trump administration has just drawn out a lot of the subterranean tensions of the United States politics. This is a time when Puerto Rico has been making, you know, headlines just in a way that is unprecedented. And you know, Trump sort of stirring up, you know, all of this sort of animosity, you know, his animosity toward Puerto Rico and saying it all out loud has actually kind of laid bare the persistent colonial relationship between the island and the mainland, and then also, you know, the other four inhabited U.S. territories. So I think we're actually living through a moment when the territorial empire of the United States is more visible than it has usually been.
Right, and I'll come back to that point in a moment. But I wanted to ask you, one of the many stories you tell in your book relates to the military bases all over the world, and you say that one of the very successful pop groups, the Beatles, was actually in part a product of these military bases, which is also very interesting in the Cold War context, of course, because the popularity of the Beatles and other Western pop groups played an enormous role in softening the Iron Curtain, and according to some historians, even the eventual downfall of the Berlin Wall. So can you comment on that? What is this relation?
Yeah, sure. So the United States has, we think, 750, or in my book at that point we thought it was 800. It's very hard to tell, but you know, that order of magnitude of overseas military bases. Many of them are secret. That's why it's hard to know exactly how many the U.S. military has. And if you take all of the bases that the U.S. currently admits to, so that's over 500, and mash them all together, you get a land area that is roughly the size of Houston. So we are not talking about a lot of acreage. Nevertheless, it is shocking how important those tiny spots, I call it a pointillist empire, have been to global history. And the people who live in the shadow of the bases are keenly aware when the United States sort of plops down and has this little sealed off enclave, or not so sealed off enclave, with its troops. And so I talk about all of the kind of dust that gets kicked up by those bases. And obviously they kick up an enormous amount of resentment. And you can attach a number of sort of, really important political events, including the Cuban Missile Crisis and 9/11 to the U.S. empire of bases. But there are also moments of really interesting interchange. And so you wouldn't think of this, but Liverpool goes from being a sort of quiet cultural town to suddenly just lighting up like a Christmas tree and being what the Guinness World Records has since called the world capital of pop. And it's not just the Beatles, it's all these bands, some of which are kind of half remembered today and many of which are not remembered at all, but we're talking like 500 bands at the time just working the area. And a question is, why? What's going on in Liverpool that makes it such a vibrant rock, gives it such a suddenly a vibrant rock scene? And the answer is that it is 15 miles from the largest single U.S. Air Force base in Europe. And there are guys there, their pockets bulging with dollars, coming out into the night, demanding entertainment in a certain form, and also bringing with them all of these quote unquote race records, meaning music by African-American artists that are otherwise unobtainable in Europe, bringing with them musical instruments, having all kinds of complicated interactions around the base. And the result is you get this music scene in Liverpool that is entirely about copying US rock with as much fidelity as possible and delivering it to the guys on the base. If you are a young Liverpudlian, that's how you live the glamorous life, is you kind of orient yourself toward that enormous military base. And that's what the Beatles do. And in my book, I describe the particular connections between each of the members of the Beatles band and like where they got the records, like how they got their hands on the records, but they all come in some way from the base.
Very interesting, yeah. So I want to go to the conclusion of your book, where you reference the fact that in the Northern Mariana Islands, clothing is produced under the label made in the USA, but that is without granting the workers any form of social security, minimum wage, or even immigration status.
Yeah.
And in a sense, you could argue that the torture practices in Guantanamo Bay follow a similar logic of a place that is American territory, but somehow the constitutional rights seem not to work at all there. Yeah, how does that work, and how is it possible, legally possible, that a territory is American but there are no American laws?
Yeah. So at its peak, the United States' colonial empire, so of inhabited territories, had about 19 million people in it, and that was 1/8 of the entire U.S. population. So if you lived in the United States at the time of World War II, you were more likely to be colonized than you were to be an immigrant or to be African American. I mean, there's a lot of people in the United States who lived in the overseas territories. That's changed. Right now, we're talking about a colonial population between 3 and 4 million, which is a much smaller percentage of the population. But nevertheless, those spaces, those inhabited territories, are really interesting, partly because, for exactly the reason you said, there's always a kind of legal question of what rules apply and what rules don't. And when you have a space of anomaly or a space of discretion like that, all kinds of things that can't happen on the mainland can happen in those spaces. So one of the examples that you gave is for quite some time, a lot of the major clothing labels were manufacturing their garments on Saipan in the Northern Mariana Islands, which is so far from where you would expect this to happen. The laborers were hauled over from China and from India, and that was a huge journey. And then the clothes had to be taken 1,000 miles. I mean, it made no sense until you realized that this was one patch of the United States where labor laws didn't apply, where immigration rules were different, where OSHA, which, overseas workplace safety, had basically no jurisdiction, and yet it was still made in the USA for trade and quota purposes. So it just kind of fit all the areas. Guantanamo Bay works the same way, right? It's a part of land over which the United States has absolute and perfect complete jurisdiction, but nevertheless, it's not technically part of the United States. So things can happen there that would violate U.S. law, but that are outside of the jurisdiction of U.S. law, even though they're in the full control of the United States. So empire has a way of sort of playing the margins in that way. These spaces are still really important today because they're spaces where all kinds of irregular activities can happen.
Right. Well, and it seems that about half of the mainland Americans are not aware that Puerto Ricans are fellow citizens. So we talked already a little bit about Puerto Rico. It isn't a state, but since 1952 it has a so-called Commonwealth status.
Yeah,
That is without voting rights for the federal government.
that's right.
But when Hurricane Maria hit the island in September 2017, there were these discussions whether it was actually um, whether the federal government was obliged to help out. And just a
Yeah.
week ago, we heard from one of the former government officials that President Trump wanted to sell Puerto Rico,
To
including
sell Puerto Rico and get Greenland. Yeah.
exactly, including its more than 3 million Americans
Yeah.
living there.
Yeah.
So it seems the US is still completely in denial. What would you say?
Yeah, no, it was incredible. So, I mean, I think that has changed a little bit, and Trump has done a lot to inadvertently and unwittingly change that. But so when hurricanes Maria and Irma hit the U.S. Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, and then hit the mainlands, the stories, the news stories at first were really focused on the mainland, and all the charitable giving was focused on the mainland, and all the federal help was focused on the mainland, and to the point where Puerto Rico took so much longer to recover and endured so much more loss of life. But that's what it is when you live in an empire where some lives matter more than others. But what broke my heart, I mean, all of it was heartbreaking, but just a twist of the knife was this. Right after this happened, so Puerto Rico is in the news as much as it ever gets to be. There was a poll done of people in the United States. I'll get to that in a second. And the pollsters asked, are Puerto Rican citizens? Like, it was a factual question. And barely half of people knew the right answer. And the right answer is yes, Puerto Ricans, in fact, have been citizens for a century. And of people under 30, adults under 30, like 37% of them knew the right answer. And then, so that's one problem. And then I thought, they asked people in the United States. So I contacted the pollsters and I was like, when you say people in the United States, what do you mean? And they're like, oh, we just meant in the States. So they would say they also had a conception of the United States that was bound by the logo map. They weren't asking people in Puerto Rico because their understanding of what it is to get quote unquote American opinion is just to ask mainlanders. So in some ways they were replicating the same ignorance that they were trying to probe. The whole thing felt really frustrating.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, there's one final point I want to bring up before we go to the Q&A, which is also
Sure.
from your conclusion, and it is the discussion about the whole birth or discussion around President Barack Obama,
Yeah.
who, as you mentioned, of course, was born in Hawaii 2 years after the island was incorporated as a US state. But then you give a counter example, interestingly, of John McCain,
Yeah.
who was born in the Panama Canal Zone. And Congress passed a statute making persons born in the Panama Canal Zone legal citizens in 1937, but he was born in 1936. So actually, if there are any legal questions, the McCain question is much more problematic than the Obama question. Of course, we had a repeat of the whole discussion with Kamala Harris recently, who is born in Oakland from legal immigrant parents. What would you say about the light this shines on the relation between legalism and structural racism?
Yeah, I think it was a really interesting moment because the 2008 election, I mean, we remember it as, the historic election of a Black president, the release of some right-wing energies that hadn't been prominently visible in U.S. politics and now seem to have taken over a lot of our politics. So it's a historic election for all kinds of reasons. But from my perspective, it was an election that also was sort of about empire. Barack Obama had come from Hawaii, born right after Hawaii became a state. So Hawaii had been a territory when his parents met. It seemed to me, and I have some documentation for why this is, that even before Barack Obama got accused of not being born in the United States, people were already probing, is he really an American? Does he really count? Is he really a natural born citizen? The fact that he's from Hawaii and not from the mainlands was already made him seem in many eyes foreign. And when I say in many eyes, I don't just mean Republican ones. I also mean in the eyes of the staff of Hillary Clinton, who considered attacking Obama on his not being fundamentally American. Hillary Clinton refused to do this, but her supporters were the ones who then kind of transmuted that rumor into Barack Obama's not actually eligible for the presidency. Therefore, Hillary Clinton technically won the primary because her opponent should be disqualified. And obviously, there's an enormous amount of anti-Black racism in that. But I also think it's sort of twisted I mean, there's been a lot of Black politicians who haven't been taken out by that particular blood libel, that they're not born in the United States. Barack Obama, the fact he was a Polynesian part of the United States, made him seem really suspicious, and I think set him up for that particular kind of attack. And the irony is that, yeah, just as you said, you can make a strong legal case that John McCain was not a natural born citizen and was not eligible to be the president. I mean, look, I think the idea of, gatekeeping the presidency based on natural born citizenry is problematic in itself. So I mean, I wouldn't want to see McCain or someone who had been born in McCain's circumstance disqualified for that reason. But it was a really interesting moment because you could both see highlighted the very complicated conditions of McCain's birth that just have to do with how empire proliferates legal anomalies. And then also you could see the racism of empire focusing on Obama. Technically, he was fine. He was born in a state. But nevertheless, to people, it just seemed wrong that a guy from Polynesia who had the kind of family experience that's really typical for people from Hawaii that he should count as an American seems in a lot of people's ears.
Right. Well, thank you very much so far, and let's go to the Q&A. So please, to all viewers, put your questions in the Q&A box. We have one from Bruce Hollihan, who writes, do you think that logo map concepts help to semantically reinforce themes of national identity and empire, blinding many who might know better otherwise?
Yeah. So I mean, my book is playfully called "How to Hide an Empire," and you might imagine from that title a smoke-filled back room where people are, hatching a conspiracy to prevent mainlanders from understanding the empire. But I don't think there is a conspiracy. I think actually our visual culture, and there's no one who's in charge of that. We just collectively, cough it up. But I think the visual culture plays a huge role. And I think that logo map and that just sort of way of mapping, I mean, it comes out of a sense of what the United States is that informs our sense of where it is. But then that feeds back, right? Our sense of where the United States is then feeds into our sense of what it is. And the logo map is basically the outlines of a republic. I mean, there are Indian reservations, there's DC, but you can look at the logo map and see, this is basically a place of states, right? Once you see the map of the greater United States, you immediately have to ask questions about the character of this polity. So yeah, I think there is a reinforcing relationship between the cartography and then our tendency to mischaracterize the United States as a nation state.
Right. So Bruce also writes, a good example was on television a few nights ago, where a daughter of a Puerto Rican referred to herself as the daughter of an immigrant, oblivious to the fact that her mother was an American citizen from birth as a Puerto Rican. I think that's a quite telling example, right?
Yeah, and that happened with Kimberly Guilfoyle. It was really, I mean, and I think it feeds into this mainland sense, in a racist sense, that there are certain people who are U.S. citizens who are born in the United States, but nevertheless are foreign. And if they move from San Juan to New York, that counts as immigration. Now, it's complicated because you can be in Puerto Rico and you can, be someone who's informed by nationalist thought and really conceive of Puerto Rico as a separate political space. And you might even talk about Puerto Rico as a separate polity and use words like immigration. I don't think that was what Kimberly Guilfoyle was doing in that speech, though. I think she was rather invoking a sense of foreignness and kind of feeding into Donald Trump's vision of the United States as a contiguous space, the kind of space you can build a wall around.
Right. Next question is by Esther Elliott. She writes, fascinating, this is all new to me. How do you see the future of the territories? What's the first thing that needs to be done to bring awareness about these complex issues? And could you provide any links to read more?
Yeah, well, I did write a book about this, which, that's my bid for, and it has it has 100 pages of notes, which, and I kind of try to guide in those notes through books. If you're looking for an academic book, a really terrific one is Patterns of Empire by Julian Go. It just gives you a sort of really great overview of the United States as empire as compared to the British one. And I thought it was a lovely book. And then there are specific books on individual colonies. But in terms of what needs to be done, I think there are two political projects that when we gaze at the US territorial empire, we might want to engage in. One is there has to be a moment when status decisions are made by people who inhabit the territories. Right now, Congress is fully in control of what happens in the U.S. overseas territories, and whether they remain, affiliated with the United States, whether they become states, whether they gain independence. All of those decisions have always been made ultimately by Congress, and those things have to be put up to binding votes of people who live in the territories and know that their vote will determine the future of their territory. So that's a really important thing. And the other thing is that, once you appreciate the territoriality of the United States' power, you also see those 750 military bases that are all over the planet and that do a lot to kind of keep the United States in a cycle of warfare and insecurity because they're easily attacked, and they're also places that stir up enormous resentment. And so I think we should talk about shrinking the size of the United States' basing empire. China only has one overseas base. And also in the last 40 years, China has only lost one life in international combat. China is not necessarily a peaceful country without rivals, but it has had a different kind of trajectory. And I think that has something to do with the fact that it has not invested heavily in military bases in other people's countries.
Right. In your book, you focus strongly on the territorial aspect of empire. You could, of course, argue, and specifically in the Cold War period and beyond, that there were many other forms in which America or the United States might be called an empire. For instance, economic globalization, cultural imperialism, etc., etc. How do you see the importance of the territorial aspect, and how do you see the relation between that and the more abstract forms of empire?
Yeah, I think my book is sometimes misread as insisting that only territory counts as empire, and that's not what I had hoped to do. I just felt like the story of the territories felt so fresh to me as a U.S. historian that my mantra became follow the territory. Right, you will always get an interesting story if you look at where power hits the ground. But you're right, that's not the only way that power works. So the United States has control of the dollar, which is functioning as the global reserve currency. Hollywood studios have successfully flooded the world with their images, thereby kind of dominating the dreams of people worldwide. In my book, I talk about the English language and sort of this incredible imperial success to the single language. No language has ever been more successful as a global second language. And that has enormous effects, some of which are quite intimate and some of which are large and structural and economic. So all of that is absolutely true. And I think if you're talking about US power after 1945, it would be kind of insane to just limit your discussion to the territorial manifestations. But on the other hand, those territorial manifestations, I try to argue, are really important, and they tend to have a sort of mutually reinforcing relationship with some of the other aspects of U.S. power. So, it's not an accident that the bases themselves are beacons for the broadcasting of U.S. culture, and that I talk a lot about the sort of cultures that grow up around the bases, that sort of, the sort of junior partners in U.S. power who come from areas right near bases. And so a lot of the kind of soft power that doesn't seem too territorial, I think actually is aided by the fact that the United States does have these little spots all over the globe that it can sort of use to station its stuff, put its people, and to make all kinds of, incursions into the land outside of the bases.
Thank you. Next question is by Ann Bobrov Hayal. She writes, are you aware of other empires that have hidden themselves as the US has, that could help us understand the undoubtedly complex process by which our empire has been hidden?
Yeah.
I'm sure it's the accumulation of many small individual decisions made by countless people, even unconsciously.
No, I think that's right. And I think it's really important to recognize that the hiding of the empire has been a collective project rather than a sort of top-down one. And And yeah, there absolutely. I think, you know, every kind of modern empire has a certain amnesia about itself, but usually that amnesia is about, you know, its actions, right? So that it, you know, British people absolutely know that, you know, about the British Empire, right? That like you can't not know that, but you could easily have a rosy view of it where you only understood it as a project of, you know, building railroads and schools, and you missed, you know, the Bengal famine during World War II and the relationship empire played with that. So, which, you know, killed 2 or 3 million people. So I think there's always a kind of forgettingness about empires, but it's usually about the nature and the acts of empires rather than the actual dimensions of empire themselves. I think what is so interesting about the United States is that its commitment to seeing itself as a nation state whose political character is Republican has actually made it very hard to see, even for people who are strong critics of the United States, even for people who see its foreign policy as imperialistic in some sense. It's actually made it really hard, even on the left, to actually see the territorial extent of the United States. And I think that is distinctive, if not entirely unique. But you know, the question lurking behind is, what can we do to sort of unthink that?
Right.
And I don't know. I mean, my hope in writing this book was to contribute to a project of literally mapping the United States differently in our minds. But in doing so, I realized what a cultural force that I'm up against, how much I was having to swim upstream. And so just in the way that sort of conceiving of the United States as a logo map and nothing more has been a collective project reinforced by generations, I think seeing the United States differently would also have to be a collective project reinforced by generations.
Right, right. So Rose Dosty asks, how has the Cold War impacted the concept of the US as a territorial empire?
Yeah.
I think we already touched on that, but maybe...
Well, sure. I think it's important to recognize that the United States, you know, the height of the United States' colonial empire is in the 1940s in terms of population. And then something really interesting happens, which is that of the United States' 4 largest inhabited colonies, so by population, so that's the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and Alaska, all of them get in the 1940s and 1950s different kinds of resolutions, different kinds of statuses. And the reason is that decolonization is happening, and the Soviet Union is using decolonization to pressure the United States. So if Washington is going to claim itself to be a bastion of liberty and a promoter of freedom wherever it goes, it's going to have to answer some hard questions about its non-self-governing territories, which it has to issue reports about and submit to the UN every year, and like to the delight of Moscow. So it's a real diplomacy problem for the United States, and one that Washington is eager to resolve. Philippine independence is large part a sort of early Cold War decolonization move. It's a way to buy some kind of legitimacy for U.S. hegemony. You know, you let go of the Philippines, you've shown that it's a deposit in the decolonization bank. You've shown that the United States can be sort of trusted with other forms of power. Alaska and Hawaii become states absolutely for that reason. There is a clear Cold War valence to that. You know, what is it going to look like internationally? And Puerto Rico is a complicated case because it is still an inhabited territory. It's neither a state, it's not independent, but it undergoes a nebulous status change where it becomes a commonwealth in the 50s. Also, in order to get it off that list of the UN's list of non-self-governing territories. Whether that was a substantive change or not, people have argued about, and I tend to think not, but nevertheless, you can see the United States responding really carefully and really forcefully to Cold War pressures as it tries to sort of distance itself from colonial empire at the same time as it's maintaining this other kind of empire that doesn't involve colonies and so doesn't really get them in the same kind of trouble.
Right, right, right. The next question asks, are museums of American history reflecting and exhibiting the cultures of these territories today? And if so, are territories claiming some of their material culture and history back, as is the case in the UK today to some sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think interestingly, the stories that we know about, you know, theft of artifacts and then, you know, displaying them in the British Museum, that's not a story that is very prominent in the history of U.S. museums in terms of its relationship with the Philippines and Guam and American Samoa, and partly because a lot of these museums haven't really invested heavily in displaying objects from those places. My sense is that, you know, if you look at museums of U.S. history or look at how textbooks are treating U.S. history, you still see basically the United States as the logo map, right? That's the unit of analysis. That's the thing of which the history is being told. So there's absolutely a story about the appropriation of Native American artifacts and how they've been a big part of museum cultures. But I don't think colonial cultures have featured in that way in US museums. And in fact, but I would like to see museums much more seriously engage with the U.S. territorial empire. Obviously, not just by, stealing artifacts, but by actually putting on exhibits that showcase these sides of the United States.
Okay. I think we have time for one final question, which is by Ray Cunningham. This is such a fascinating discussion, very thought-provoking. Current domestic partisan vitriol notwithstanding, how do you see the Trump presidency and the current standing of the U.S. on the world stage as affecting all aspects of our unique imperial or global influence, including our footprint going back to the Cold War period forward, both short term and longer term, even as we move on from the Trump era? Thank you.
I'll take the second part first. Just kidding.
Right.
It's a long question, but I'll say this. I mean, I think that Trump has done two things. I think on the one hand, Trump has inadvertently pointed his finger to a lot of aspects of U.S. power that we weren't talking about, partly by throwing them into a crisis. So, for example, he wants to build a wall, and he's consistently talked about using military funds, which are some of the funds that he actually has at his availability, to do that. And so that means taking money away from military construction, and that means base closures, or the U.S. not being able to sort of dynamically move its basing system and open new bases here as it closes bases there. And so suddenly we're talking about military bases, and those just had been sort of silently there from the point of view of the mainland, and now they're a thing that we argue about. Same thing with the territories. On the other hand, I think there's a serious continuity in terms of how Trump thinks about these places. He's a little cruder, and he will say things like, maybe the United States should sell Puerto Rico. But the basic structure of racism, where there are some lives that matter in some places that matter and there are others that don't, that's really intact. So when Trump speaks about Puerto Rico, he'll say things like this. This is a direct quote. He'll say, "I hate to tell you, Puerto Rico, but you've thrown our budget out of whack." And you can just hear the us and them and the here and there. There's Puerto Rico isn't really part of the polity that Donald Trump cares about. It's a them. It's a foreign. It's an other. But look, that's not so different from other U.S. presidents. Woodrow Wilson, one of the most idealistic U.S. presidents, said something almost identical. Just it sounded prettier. He said, in speaking of the overseas territories, they lie outside of the charm circle of our national life. Outside of it's the same inside and outside. It's just said in a more eloquent way. So I think Trump is highlighting, but he's not actually changing the United States' relationship to its territorial empire.
And maybe by highlighting, it's also a first step to do something about it.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, there are some anti-imperial activists who really think that they're kind of Leninists in the sense of, if you heighten the contradictions, then finally you'll get change. That there's been so much stasis in U.S. territorial relations that actually this is an exciting moment for potential change, even as it's a really scary one as well.
Right. Daniel, I want to thank you very, very much for this highly interesting and eye-opening presentation.
Of course, it's a pleasure.
Thank you. So next week, my guest is Leonard Schmieding, the Curator of Education at the Staatliche Museen zu Berlin, the State Museums of Berlin, with whom I will speak about counterculture space, the East German hip-hop scene. And yes, indeed, there was an East German hip-hop scene. So I hope to see you next week. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.